So as we start the book of Ezra, let's talk about the Old Testament eras of history. I've referred to these a few times as we've gone throughout this series. One of the earliest things I remember learning as a child, Mom and Dad had bought us a book called 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. It's by a man named Max Anders. By the way, if you can find one of those older used copies, that's a fantastic resource that helps you understand the Bible and its structure. It's how I can picture the Bible put together to this very day. And one of the things that it taught was the eras of history. When you have the Old Testament, you've got 39 books, and yet it doesn't read like a narrative the way we do. In fact, when you get through the first 17 books of the Old Testament, you have completed the history of the Old Testament. That encapsulates all of the history that's pertained. And then you've got books of prophecy and books of wisdom literature that fit within those. And so it also helps to figure out where these stories fit by thinking about the eras. And those eras, we won't just go over these and teach these right now, but these eras are on the top. And so as we've gone through these overviews of basically Genesis through 2 Kings, we've covered most of the history of the Old Testament. And now that we're in the book of Ezra, we're here in what we might call the return era, or if you want a fancier name, some people call this the post-exilic era. This is the era when the Israelites, when the Jews are going to be returning from Babylonian captivity, from their exile. And Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are the three books of history that teach about and occur during that period. And so that's where we are here with the book of Ezra. As we talk about the title and who wrote the book of Ezra, obviously the title is Ezra, and that is probably the author. That's the most traditional view, is that Ezra was the author of this book. And he, of course, is a main character, but he's not the only character. In fact, Ezra doesn't come into the story until chapter 7. The first 6 chapters are told in a third-person perspective and actually take place several decades before the life of Ezra. And then in chapters 7 through 10, that's a typo I just saw there. That should be chapter 7 through 10. I apologize for that. Chapter 7 through 10 end up being told in the first-person perspective. And so that is written by Ezra about his own account, but he probably is the writer of the rest of the book as well. Now originally, and we've seen this in some of the other books, like with Samuel and Kings, where our English translations break them up into multiple books. In the original Hebrew Bible, some of these were larger one-unit books, and that's true here. Originally, from what I've read, Ezra and Nehemiah were considered one work, but it was later on, in fact, in Latin translations that they began to be separated. And so Ezra may have even written the book of Nehemiah and was probably instrumental in at least formatting that book as well. And so that's that little bit of information. Now, a historical background is helpful when we get to the book of Ezra. Not only a religious background, which we've covered from Israel's perspective all the way through 2 Kings, but what's taking place and what has taken place in world history that leads up to the book of Ezra. Now, back in 608 BC, and these dates, you might find slight variations of dates. You kind of just have to pick one and go with it sometimes. But these, once we get to this part of history, we can get pretty close, or historians can get pretty close. But 608 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had carried away the first wave of exiles. If you remember in the books of Kings and also in Chronicles, Nebuchadnezzar did not just come and destroy Jerusalem and take everybody away captive. He came and besieged the city, and he took his first wave of captives, and then there were 2 more waves. In fact, it was several years later, in 586 BC, that Nebuchadnezzar came back and took the third and final wave of captives, and it's at that time, due to some of their rebellious activities, that he just destroyed the city. He destroyed the temple, he left Jerusalem in ruins, and took most of the rest of the people away to captivity in Babylon. Well, we fast forward a few more decades, and in 559 BC, Cyrus becomes king of Persia. Now, that's the king of Persia, but he is not really the emperor of the world at this point. It takes him a while, and that's important because the Bible will refer to the first year of the reign of Cyrus. But that actually takes place several years into his reign, but it's his reign basically over all the empire, not just his reign over Persia. But he becomes king of Persia, and then about 10 years later, he overthrows his own grandfather, who was the king of the Median Empire. They were the Medo-Persia Empire. You've probably heard of that before. And so in 549, Cyrus overthrows that his grandfather. So he now is over Media and Persia. And then it's another 10 years when he conquers the city of Babylon. And we even read about that in the book of Daniel. We read about how the city of Babylon fell under the reign of Belshazzar without even a fight. And the city, and literally overnight, Cyrus became the ruler of the world with the toppling of the Babylonian Empire. And just a note of interest is this historical background. By the way, this is where Ezra is going to pick up, is 538 BC. And just a note of interest here, a couple of things that are happening in this time period of world history. First of all, it's probably during this time that the Israelites began to be called Jews. Now, we see that term used frequently in the New Testament. It's how we often refer to Jewish people. But previous to this era of history, they were typically referred to as Hebrews or Israelites. But of course, after the separation of the kingdoms, there was the northern nation of Israel, which was 10 tribes, and then there was the main tribe of Judah, as well as Benjamin, that was the southern kingdom of Judah. And so from time going forward, the Hebrews began to be known as Jews, that is, one from Judah. In fact, since Israel never really was established again, really anyone that was from this descent, even though there may be people that would come from tribes like Zebulun and Naphtali and these northern tribes, ultimately became referred to and known as Jewish people. And we start to read that in this area of the Bible. Now, we pick up, like I said, here around 539, 538 BC, and then Ezra is going to cover a time frame of about 80 years. So in those 10 chapters, we're going to cover two significant events, two significant time frames that cover a period of close to 80 years. This is the geography. I know some people like the geography, some people don't. If you don't, we'll go through this very quickly. But there are two main events that take place in the book of Ezra. There is the first return that takes place under Zerubbabel and Joshua, and that is noted here in this red line on the map. And then there is another return that we read about in chapters 7 through 10, and that's the return that's led by Ezra, when Ezra is sent back to Jerusalem. And he takes, and this may not look like much of a different path, but it is a shorter path that gets away from the Euphrates. It crosses the desolate areas, and it was actually a very dangerous path. In fact, the text talks about his prayer for God's guidance, and God blessed them with a quick travel and safety in what would have been a very dangerous journey. And so there were two major trips that we read about here in the book of Ezra as the Jewish people move away from Babylon and back to their home of Jerusalem in Judea. Now, as we read through the book of Ezra, it's one of those that it can get very confusing as we read through, because there's all these names and all these characters. And so we'll just outline a few of these individuals. First of all, it's helpful to know a little bit about the Persian Kings. And this is an exciting era of the Bible, because this is one of the eras. This is still very ancient history, but now we start getting into areas where we start having a lot of historical information about these kings and these kingdoms and these empires. In fact, I've been in museums in Europe and the United Kingdom that have relics from these kingdoms. Images you can see online. I've seen some of the inscriptions and statues from this era of time. And so it's, to me at least, very interesting. But in the Persian Empire, of course, the first king after the conquering of Babylon is Cyrus the Great. He's the one who's going to issue the decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem. There's two men in between that the Bible doesn't have anything to say about, Cambyses and Smerdis. You can read about some of the interesting history with them. Smerdis only reigned for about 7 months, and history is even a little vague of whether this was actually Cambyses' brother, or if it was an individual that was an imposter that tried to usurp the throne. But anyway, he ends up being killed by Darius after only reigning for about 7 months. And then we have the man named Darius, or Darius the First. And this is the man who's going to reinstate Cyrus's decree to rebuild Jerusalem and also the temple. Then we have Ahasuerus, more popularly known as Xerxes. This is the man that marries Esther, and we read about in the book of Esther. And then there is Artaxerxes the first, who is the one who sends Ezra and Nehemiah back to Jerusalem in the final two waves. So we have quite a bit of time between, and several kings between the first time that the Jews are allowed to be sent back to Jerusalem under the reign of Cyrus the Great, and when Artaxerxes the first sends back the next two waves under Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, for the Jewish people, there's several Jewish leaders that we read about in the book of Ezra. First of all, there's a man named Zerubbabel. He's the grandson of Jehoiachin, and that was the king of Judah. And so Zerubbabel, well, he will never sit on the throne of Israel. In fact, no one will ever sit on the literal physical throne of Israel again, or of Judah again. But if there would have been a king, Zerubbabel would have been the man who had the right to the throne. He was the grandson of Jehoiachin and rightful heir. It's probably the individual in chapter 1, if you read through the names, who's named Sheshbazzar. You might remember in the book of Daniel that the Hebrews were frequently given different names, and that was Jehoiachin's name most likely. He's the prince of Judah that's referred to there, and he is the primary leader when the Jews are allowed to go back to Jerusalem in 538 BC. He's the primary leader, along with a man named Jeshua or Joshua, and that is the high priest at that time. He's the son of Jehozadak, who had probably been carried away into captivity. And so him, along with Zerubbabel, become the primary leadership in rebuilding the temple. Now, they need some help. There's some hardships that come along, and the people don't do their job as fully as they should. And so we have two prophets that are encountered during this time. In fact, they're even mentioned in the book of Ezra, and that is Haggai and Zechariah. And of course, you can read their prophecies. So they're working. So when you read Haggai and Zechariah much later in our order of books in the Old Testament, in fact, they're the second and third to the last books in the Old Testament, you're reading about men who worked and prophesied during the life, before Ezra actually, during the time of Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And then, of course, there is Ezra, that we read about in the final few chapters, who is part of the second wave. He was a direct descendant of Aaron, and therefore he could have been the high priest, but he grew up in Babylon, and so he never fulfilled this role, or at least for most of his life. But he did spend his life studying the law of Moses, and he became a very skilled scribe, we're told. He was an expert in the law, and he led the second wave of Jews to return from Persia to Jerusalem about 458 BC, and that's about 80 years after the first return had occurred. And he goes back to restore proper worship and living conditions, and Ezra is really an unsung hero of history. And there's not a lot that we're told about specifically in the Bible, but traditional views hold that he probably did a lot of things that we recognize and that we're thankful for. For one, Ezra is accredited with establishing the great synagogue and the synagogue style of worship. You know, you don't read about synagogues in the Old Testament, but you get to the New Testament and you find this pattern of worship. You find this form of worship or this activity that Jews partook in on Sabbath. They would go to the synagogue. You read Paul going to city after city and going to synagogues. You read about Jesus in synagogues. And it's probably during this time period, in fact, it's probably Ezra who plays an instrumental role in formulating that idea and that concept that would stick over the next several centuries. He's also accredited with putting together the official canon of the Old Testament. And so it's not, now some people go too far with how the Old Testament gets put together. Obviously they were inspired writings. The men that wrote them were inspired by God. But we often also don't think about how did they all get together? How did the Bible get put together the way that it is in the Hebrew Bible that would lead to the variations later in Greek and Latin and English translations? Well, it had to be compiled. And Ezra is the one who's considered most likely to have been the individual that did much of that. In fact, he's credited by some as the individual who arranged the Psalms in the way that they are arranged. And so he was very instrumental, and we probably owe a lot of thanks to Ezra and his work for the way we have the Bible even today. Many view that he was probably the author of Chronicles. Chronicles retells the story of 1st and 2nd Kings in a sense, but it focuses on Judah, and it has a very priestly view. And so given Ezra's background and the fact that he was a priest or could have been a priest, then that makes a great deal of sense. And also, this is kind of interesting. In secular history, there's not a lot of people that will talk about or know Ezra, but as I mentioned, he's actually probably owed thanks for a lot of things, and he was actually living in a time of a lot of men that would become well known in history. In fact, during the events that are written of and recorded in the book of Ezra, Gautama Buddha was in India, who had a pretty big impact on the world. Confucius was in China, and Socrates was in Greece. And so just an incredible time period of history. Obviously, we don't agree with a lot of what those other men taught and formed, but while those men were laying their foundations for what would change world history, Ezra was alive and doing great work and noble work that impacted history in an even more positive way. And so let's talk about the outline. As we look at the book of Ezra, we can divide it up into two sections. We've already kind of considered this. There's the first return under Zerubbabel that is recorded in chapters 1 through 6. And then there is the second return under Ezra that we read about in chapters 7 through 10. So we'll just go through these sections. And again, we won't have time to just talk in detail about them, but we'll go through the various chapters and kind of outline the story of Ezra so that you have some framework to understand it from a high level and then dig deeper as you might choose to do so on your own time. So the return to Jerusalem, the initial return to Jerusalem, as we open up Ezra and we look at chapters 1 and 2, we read that in the first year of Cyrus, so sometime in 538 BC, Cyrus decrees that the Jews, all Jews, any Jew who desires to, is allowed to return to Jerusalem. And not only would they be allowed to return, but he wants them to rebuild their temple, and they would be aided in doing so. And so a huge turnaround. They've gone from captives, they've gone from exiles, to now the people that actually are over them, their overlords and masters, are now telling them they can go back. Now, they're still going to be under Persian governance, but they can go back, they can rebuild the temple, and Cyrus is even promising help to rebuild the temple. Now that date is important, 538 BC, because that comes exactly 70 years after the first wave of exiles was taken by Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, that was in 608 BC, 70 years later. Now why is that important? Well, if you go over and read Jeremiah 29, verses 10 through 14, you'll find that Jeremiah had prophesied that the Jewish captivity would last 70 years. And that's exactly what happens. This is one of those prophecies in the Bible that just shows the inspiration and the amazing nature of prophecy in the Bible. Now, Isaiah actually names Cyrus. Before Cyrus was even born, before there was even a Medo-Persian kingdom, Isaiah names Cyrus. So that's another amazing prophecy. But Jeremiah mentions it will be 70 years, and that's exactly what we find from the first wave of captives to the first wave of returnees to Jerusalem. And as we read through those chapters, we find that the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin and certain Levites were ready and willing to head back. Zerubbabel, whose father again was Jeconiah or Jehoiachin, who he had been the prisoner of Nebuchadnezzar, but he had later been released and treated as a prince. You can read about that in 2 Kings 24. And these people are allowed to go back. And Cyrus even gives funds. He gives money to the Jews to return to Jerusalem. And he gives them back even many of the precious items that Nebuchadnezzar had taken away. Before Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed the temple, he had looted it and he had plundered it, and all of its precious items were taken away. And Cyrus actually gives those back to the Jewish people to take back home and to put back in their temple when they rebuild it. And so chapter 2 takes a census of this remnant, of the people that are going to be returning home with Zerubbabel. And it shows us the leaders, and it numbers the people and the priests and the Levites and the servants and all the people that were able to prove their genealogy. And then there were some that weren't. But when it's all added up, there was a little under 50,000 people. Now that's a big group. If you were to travel on a caravan of 50,000 people, that's a lot of people. But I also want you to think about, remember another major census in the Bible, go all the way back to the book of Numbers. And out of Egypt, there were over 600,000 fighting men over the age of 20. You extrapolate that out, Israel was probably, when they came out of Egypt, a nation of 2 or 3 million people. And they probably grew over the years as they inhabited Judah and Israel. And now here they are, and so thankful to be returning. And yet we've gone from 3+ million people down to 50,000. That's only slightly bigger than Lawrence County. That's like going from the population of Nashville down to the population of our county. That's a huge difference. But what's amazing about that is, while that might seem discouraging and that might seem small, even against all the odds, what's God doing? God is still keeping his promises. Even when the nation looks like it will never come back, and it never will come back to what it once was, because that's not God's plan. But even with the smallest amounts of possibility, God is working to bring about his promises. From this remnant, God is still going to be able to bring forth the promised Messiah. So then in chapter 3, as the Jews return and they get back to Jerusalem, they begin rebuilding the temple. And we see some beautiful motives. They were in the right place. They wanted to rebuild the temple, and they started to lay the foundation. But one of the first things that they do, in fact, the first thing that Zerubbabel and Jeshua did, is they rebuild the altar so that they can begin offering sacrifices. Now, think about this. For 70 years, now Israel and Judah had corrupted worship many times over. But you would imagine that many of these people had longed to be able to worship God. They haven't been able to for 7 decades. Not the way that they're supposed to in the law. They can't go to Jerusalem. They can't go to the temple. They can't offer sacrifices at the temple. They can't celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. They cannot worship God. And finally, this group of people is able to go home. And the first thing they do is they build an altar and they make sacrifices to God. What a beautiful picture that the first thing these people do with their freedom is they sacrifice to God, because that's what they knew God deserved and what they wanted to do. And so they set their heart on worshiping God. They set their heart on reinstituting the feasts, and they set their heart on rebuilding the temple. And so they begin, and they start by the foundation. It's where you've got to start when you build a new building, is the foundation. And so the foundation has been laid, and it's a very interesting thing that happens in chapter 3, because there's this incredibly strange noise that comes from the city of Jerusalem. And it's a strange noise because many of these people, they see the foundation, and it's step 1 of rebuilding the temple, and they're so excited, and they begin to sing forth with praise and exclaim praise and joy. But mingled with all of that shout of joy, there are other people that begin to weep. You say, well, why would people weep? Well, there are actually people in this crowd who were elderly people by this point, but they're old enough that they remembered seeing Solomon's temple before that third wave when Nebuchadnezzar tore it down. They remembered seeing that temple. And now they've gone 50+ years, and they get to see the foundation laid. And surely they're thankful, but they can tell just by the foundation, this isn't going to be Solomon's temple. It's not going to be what it was. The glory that they had remembered from their youth, they were never going to see again in a physical temple. And they weep. I think, well, surely it's good to at least have a temple, but think about what must have been going through their mind. That they were going, and their children and their grandchildren were going to have to deal with a less glorious replacement. And why? Because they had sinned. And they had rebelled. And they had lost something. And they were never going to get it back in their lifetime. And so I'm sure they were joyful, but over that they weep. And so this strange sound fills Jerusalem as weeping and rejoicing are mixed together. Well, in chapter 4, we have conflict. Just as any time when God's people are trying to work, Satan does his best to thwart those good activities, and he does the same to the Jews in Jerusalem. Chapter 4, first of all, they face an interruption when adversaries come and want to build with them. So there's some people from the land that come and they see what they're doing and they want to participate in the rebuilding. And who these people actually are the Samaritans. We read a lot more about the Samaritans in the New Testament. You probably have heard or remember others teaching about, or maybe we've had it in some of our lessons, when the northern nation of Israel had been carried off captive by Assyria over about a century and a half before Babylon captured Judah. When Assyria did that, Assyria took most of the people away, but they left some of the poorer class, and they transplanted people from all of their other conquered kingdoms into Samaria, which is where the capital city of Israel was, into that part of the country. And they did that for a reason. They knew that if they could cause all these different nations, if they transplanted people and these people intermingled with one another, they wouldn't have their original national identities. And it was very successful, Assyria. It was one way to keep the people down. And that's what happened in Samaria. These people that are brought in, they learn some of the ways. In fact, when you read about it, it almost starts to sound good, because the Israelites that were there, they began teaching these foreigners about the God of heaven, about Yahweh. And they're teaching him about the one true God and how to worship him. But the problem is they don't stop there, and they start listening to these people and their practices and their religions. And they begin to intermarry with these people. And before long, you don't have Israelites at all. You have a new mixed race, that is the Samaritans. Well, these people have been in the land for a while. So now that Jerusalem's being rebuilt, they come and they want to be a part of it. But they are not allowed to, because of their impurity, because of their faithlessness. The Jews say, you can't be a part of this project. Well, they become very bitter about that. They become bitter enemies, and this rivalry and this hatred between the Samaritans and the Jewish people is going to continue until, obviously, in the New Testament we read about it a great deal. But what happens from this point on is the Samaritans and other adversaries that didn't want to see Jerusalem rebuilt, they do everything that they can to stop the temple and the city of Jerusalem being built. And so they begin sending messages. Now, by this time, as some time progresses, new kings arise, as you might remember that list. And so these people, the Samaritans and other adversaries, begin writing messages and sending messages back to the kings of Persia, trying to persuade them that they should make the Jews stop and halt. They tell them that they're a rebellious people, and they tell them their history is full of rebellion, and if they're allowed to build their temple, if they're allowed to build their walls, it will be nothing but problems. And so many of the kings listen. A few of the kings issue edicts that force them to stop. But then a few kings later, under Darius, when he reviews the situation and he goes back and he finds Cyrus's original decree, then he issues a decree that Cyrus's decree is to be kept. In fact, if anybody hinders the work from this point on, he says, they are going to be punished. And he has some very graphic descriptions about how they are to be punished. But that only lasts for so long, and trouble arises again. Now, in chapter 4, there's kind of an interesting passage. It's a little bit of a difficult passage chronologically, and some people try and find fault with it. But basically, it lists some kings, and for time's sake, I won't get into all the details and the various views. But I believe what's taking place in this passage is it's kind of a parenthetical. It's not meant to keep the chronology going. Ezra pauses here and just talks about the hardships that face the Israelite people from the beginning of the building of the temple until even into his life, which is, again, over 80 years later. And so I think if we reconstruct it, what the Samaritans had done is they had sent counselors to, remember those kings Cambyses and Smerdis and Darius, all of them trying to always encourage the work to stop. And Cambyses and Smerdis seem to maybe have done that. But Darius, when he reviews that decree, he reinstitutes the proclamation that the temple should be rebuilt. And then it's under Darius's reign, during Darius's reign, that the temple is finally completed. But then again, complaints start again during Ahasuerus' reign. And it's Artaxerxes who, apparently for the first 6 years of his reign, allows the building of Jerusalem to be halted. But it's during the 7th year of his reign that he finally sends Ezra back. And Ezra reestablishes proper worship. The temple has been built, but worship needs to be reestablished again. Again, this is quite a bit of time since the temple's been finished and Ezra comes back. And then 13 years after Ezra goes back, Artaxerxes sends Nehemiah. You remember, that is to rebuild the walls of the city. And so I think that's the reconstruction. And this passage, chapter 4, verse 6 through 24, it's giving that whole picture. So it's not a chronological setting in that place. But chapters 5 through 6 talk about that process. It picks the story back up from the beginning of chapter 4 about the rebuilding of the temple. Now, we just jumped from one chapter to the next, but actually there's about 16 years that happen between chapter 4 and chapter 5 in Ezra. There's a few kings and 16 years, and the temple still has not been built. It started, but it's not been built because of the adversaries, because of the edicts, and then because the people, facing some of those hardships, just kind of give up and start making their own lives. They just stop. And so God sends two prophets. He sends Haggai and Zechariah. And you can read those books, and they're heavily focused on the need to rebuild the temple. In fact, one of the notes from Haggai, he asks them if it's a time to live in paneled houses when God's house lies in ruins because they had stopped building the temple. And it seems like Zerubbabel and Jeshua had even given in to the lethargy. Maybe they had become discouraged by all the adversaries. Maybe they'd become discouraged by the people giving up. But when Haggai and Zechariah are sent, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are reignited with zeal, and so are the people. And they get to work, and they, under Darius's decree, they begin building the temple and finishing the temple, and they're able to complete the temple, and so that it is fully set up once again. And so now they finally have a place to worship. They're able to reinstitute the Passover. In fact, once it's completed that the priests consecrate the temple, and they observe the first Passover in decades, as they observe that in the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so a wonderful story comes to a conclusion there. But then we fast forward about 60 years from the completion of the temple in chapter 6 to the story of Ezra in chapter 7. And so after several decades, we're not told all the details that take place in between, but we pick up during the reign of King Artaxerxes. And by the way, between chapter 6 and 7, there's about 60 years, and also there's an entire book of the Bible that fits in between those chapters, and that's the story of Esther. Now, in our Bibles, we have Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, but if you were actually to arrange those chronologically, it would be Ezra 1 through 6, and then Esther, and then Ezra 7 through the rest of the book and the book of Nehemiah. So just a little bit of information of where Esther fits in the timeline here. But in the 7th year of Artaxerxes, he allows Ezra to go back to Jerusalem. There's problems that Ezra needs to go back and try and deal with and help reinstitute proper worship and living conditions, and Artaxerxes approves of this. In fact, he sends him with his blessing. He offers a guard to be able to go with him, but Ezra does not accept that. He wants to go and just simply trust in God, and that's exactly what he does, and he returns to Jerusalem. But when he gets there, and by the way, this is a pretty small return, only about 2,500 people go with Ezra when he returns to Jerusalem. But when he gets there, there is a problem. And you might remember this problem because James talked a little bit about it. The next generation is going to have the same problem with the generation of Malachi. But when Ezra gets back, we read that the people, and not just the people, but the people, the priests, and the Levites had intermarried with the Canaanites and the Hittites and all of those people that Deuteronomy had specifically forbidden them from marrying. And so they're intermarrying. And what's happening here? Why is that such a big deal? Well, one, it's a violation of the law. But two, it begins to jeopardize the nation. They are in danger of doing the exact same thing that the Samaritans, of what led to the Samaritans. They're intermingling with the foreign nations. And that in Israel's history, that always led to something, idolatry. It always led to unfaithfulness. when the nation on wide scales intermarried with the pagan nations. And so when Ezra gets back, he sees this. And again, it's not just the people, it's the leaders. It's the Levites, it's the priests, and it's the people. And Ezra is stricken with grief upon finding this out. In fact, we're told that he tore his clothes and he fasts the entire day until the evening sacrifice. And then when evening came, Ezra offered a prayer to God for all the people, and perhaps one of the most beautiful intercessory prayers you will read in the Bible. We don't have time to read it right now, but if you pick a passage out to read in the book of Ezra, maybe you've got other passages in Ezra that you really like, but I would recommend the end of chapter 9 and read Ezra's prayer. In fact, if you want to learn about prayer, read Ezra's prayer. It's a beautiful prayer, and it is a powerful prayer. And then in chapter 10, the nation is moved by Ezra's display of grief. They are moved by his prayer. They are moved by his teaching, and they are convicted of their sins. They recognize that what they are doing is wrong, and they openly confess that wrongdoing, and they want to do right. And so they put Ezra in charge of seeing that things are corrected. And what that's going to entail is putting away their foreign wives. And so Ezra takes the lead. He appoints others to help them. And over the course of about 3 months, the nation puts away all of the pagan wives that they had taken. Now that may seem strange. Again, in Malachi, you read that God hates divorce. And we see that principle throughout the Bible. So why in Ezra is God apparently commanding divorce? Why is Ezra telling the people to put away their wives? Well, there are a couple of reasons why this needed to be done. First of all, this widespread intermarriage was going to taint and ruin the bloodline of the last remnant of faithful Israel. They were going to become like the Samaritans. They weren't going to be a special people. They were going to be an assimilated culture, just like the rest of many of these other nations, just like the Samaritans. And that was not God's purpose for them. And secondly, the time period of Ezra was one of great religious tolerance, more so than genetics, because there are others that are mixed in, obviously, like Rahab and Ruth, that were from other nations, but they became God-fearers. They became obedient. But during the time of Ezra, this is a time of religious tolerance, and that sounds like a good thing, but what that means is basically everything goes, and everybody borrows from this religion and that religion, and all these religions get mixed, and all religions are correct and popular. And the nation of Israel, because it's intermarrying with all these people and nations, they're in danger of that idea. They're in danger of losing once again their focus and commitment to the one true God. And so they need to get rid of the problem. They needed to return to being God's special people. And so extreme measures had to be taken to make sure that the bloodline and the spirituality of God's people remained pure. And they did this by putting away the evil influence of their pagan wives. And I fully believe, by the way, that the pagan wives that were put away were pagan wives, or maybe even pagan husbands, that did not want to worship the one true God. I fully believe that if there were women who were like Ruth, who had shed their past idolatry, and who wanted to be God-fearers, and they wanted to worship Yahweh, I have no doubt that those women were allowed to remain married to their husbands, because that was always the case in Israel's history. But this was a problem because the Jews were intermarrying with people who were not turning to God, but were instead turning the people away from God. And so this great task is undertaken, this great repentance is taken, and the nation gets back on the right track. Well, as we look at the book of Ezra, clearly it continues the history of God's people, and it shows us just another step in God's redemptive plan. But something it shows us, and we hinted at this a little bit, is God's faithfulness. You read through the books of Kings and Chronicles, and it just goes down and down and down as things get darker and worse until God, and especially if you read the prophets, the warnings and the judgments, until God has to allow his people to be captured by Babylon, and he allows his temple to be destroyed. And you'd think that if you were reading it for the first time, you'd think it was hopeless. You might even think God had given up on these people. But then you begin reading Ezra, and you see, against all odds, God is still working, and he's still keeping his promises. Now, that also showcases in this book the need for us to be faithful to God, the need of faithfulness and perseverance and repentance. We see all those displayed throughout the book of Ezra. But then Ezra is an interesting book to me. Again, interesting time period, because when we get to Ezra, we really see the progression starting to pick up. We're only a few centuries at this point, about 5 centuries away from Jesus. And Ezra is beginning to lay that groundwork. The people are coming back. The groundwork is being laid. The Messiah is coming. And Ezra does his part, and the people of his time period do their part to take that next step towards that point of history in God's redemptive plan.